Oh, Godless Cranium, what have you done?
Well, we know one thing. Existence would have to be imparted to such essences from without. Could an essence say of a dog,
calls for a German beer.
which is really distinct from its existence, impart
From
existence
an English-themed brewery,
as
St.
prior
George's.
to existing? Well, of course not. Since if the essence considered in itself does not
Let's
have
hear it.
existence, then it cannot impart anything to it. For it must exist in the order of logical priority, in order for it to impart anything to it, let alone
This
existence,
calls for
which is obviously
rum.
absurd. Therefore, existence...
Kids, don't try this at home. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, InaneDragon, and tonight I'm hoping to make a quick rebuttal to a few things said over on Godless Cranium's channel by guest speaker Classical Theist. In short, Classical Theist uses some quick language and redefinitions to try and talk his way into a theistic, pantheistic god of undefinably knowableness. And in doing so, he thinks that he's formulated a challenge for atheists on YouTube. Oh, and before we get started, after reading the comments on Godless Cranium's video, I have to put out a ground rule. When you say it's no good to respond to this argument simply by asserting that it doesn't match up to your standard of rational scrutiny, you are confused, Classical Theist. The fact of the matter is that you have made the claim, with the intention of convincing us of its veracity. It is our standard of evidence that is relevant, not yours. Otherwise, you could make the claim, God is because God is, and demand that we refute that horse shit. We both like analogies, so try this on for size. Our concept of a duel in Western culture, at least in a fair bit of fiction, is that the challenged person chooses the form of the duel. You, sir, are the challenger. I am the challenged. It is not my fault if, after I call for pistols at noon, you attempt a round of rock, paper, scissors. That out of the way! Roll it!
Well, first, let's define our term and work towards a comprehensive definition of God to the best one can, as understood in this tradition. At its core, the word God refers to that absolutely simple, metaphysically ultimate reality or first principle, the essence of which is simply and unqualifiedly to exist. That's going to be our working definition, from which everything else I'll say about God in this video flows.
Oh dear, we're going to spend quite some time working out what an essence is, what existing means, how something can not exist, and a bunch of woo that tells us nothing ultimately about the reality in which we appear to exist. Aren't we? I don't mean to be rude, but unless your premises are grounded in observable, demonstrable facts, logic and reason do not work. Philosophy, ungrounded in facts, is just word salad at best, and intellectual masturbation at worst. So let's open strong with the demonstration of the facts from which you'll derive your premises, okay? Oh, and I'm skipping all of your bits about classical theism versus theistic personalization. Why? Because at the end of the day, they're functionally equivalent. No Christian apologist claims God is anything other than simple, existing necessarily, and anything which is a being. To be, being. Therefore, your God's a being too. You just don't like it when we call you out on that.
So concepts like change, substance, essence, nature, causality, existence, etc., are all clearly concepts that we take for granted and deem ourselves rational to take seriously. But what metaphysics does is it's going to take those concepts and get at the heart of what they are in relation to each other, in themselves, and in relation to our experience, as amenable to the laws of logic. Almost every discipline we engage in, including the natural sciences, presupposes concepts such as this, and so we had better get to the bottom of what they coherently mean if we are to take any of these disciplines seriously.
You're reversing cause and effect in thought, my dude. Everyone, philosophers included, start with observation of the external world around them, our apparent reality. From these observations, even as children, we develop basic models, such as causality. Then we test these models against observed reality and keep the ones that work. All knowledge begins with sensory input of one form or another. how this applies to metaphysics is that metaphysics takes those models that are so basic to our everyday experience and attempts to extrapolate the nature of reality at a very deep level using nothing more than logical thinking. A good metaphysicist recognizes that every axiom and presupposition they apply in metaphysics is based ultimately in human observation of the world around them. Consequently, when further observations falsify or place limits on the applicability of an axiom or presupposition, they revise their philosophy to reflect reality. Unfortunately, that's where the modern Aristotelians come in, and they get it into their head that somehow their axioms are deduced from so-called pure reason, and that they could therefore discover the underlying nature of reality without ever once referring to said reality. This is where you come in and prove my point for me.
But the abstractions are extracted from empirical realities we take for granted and presuppose before we can even do science.
See what I mean? This is exactly what I was saying about the basic failure of modern philosophers employing Aristotelian thought. Empirical realities that we take for granted that are presupposed before we can, and I quote, do science. Empirical reality is the reality derived from observation and experimentation. That is to say, that empirical reality is reality as understood through science. It's a feedback loop. You are correct. Observation is the first step of science. It's also the first step of philosophy. You need data to operate, and the only source of new data is the world around you. So, since you agree that empirical evidence is the foundation for the presuppositions made in metaphysics, you will have empirical evidence for those presuppositions and your resulting premises. Correct?
Before we dive into the argument for God's existence, in order to make sense of the argument's conclusion, we need first to go over a metaphysical principle that underlies the fabric of the argument. And that is the distinction between potentiality and actuality, or act and potency, to use the traditional jargon. And this will bring us back to pre-Socratic philosophy in ancient Greece. Among the pre-Socratics, there were three philosophers in particular that are worthy of note in discussing this argument: Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Zeno. Parmenides maintained that being of necessity was absolute, static, and that change and multiplicity were impossible. Sounds nuts, right? Well, not so fast. His argument was as follows. In order to undergo change, that which is not would have to affect that which is. For any outcome of change necessarily does not exist as yet, but that which is outside of being can only be non-being. If a leaf were to change color, for instance, how can this happen if the color it will change into, or the process under which it will change, or under which such a change could occur, does not exist? There is no existential room, as it were, for that which does not exist to affect that which does exist. Since the new color does not exist, it can never exist, since out of nothing comes nothing, so we argued.
Parmenides reverses cause and effect, which is to say that the green leaf isn't turned brown by the brown leaf it will become. Rather, it is turned brown by extant processes. These processes were happening all along. Nothing had to begin to exist from nothing for this to happen. This explanation can continue for anything to which known physics applies. Therefore, he's wrong, the logic is false, and may be dismissed without further rebuttal. Furthermore, the premise that out of nothing nothing comes is not a premise based in fact. We have no examples of nothing to examine the behavior of nothingness. The closest thing which we can conceive of to actual nothingness is extremely unstable, producing all kinds of effects with no apparent cause. There is no empirical basis for this premise and appears to be a potential counterfactual out there, and so no argument based on it can be sound at this point in time. This also leads to the fact that cause and effect are space-time phenomena that only apply internally to our macro-scale observations of the universe, and is not necessarily a fundamental property of our universe or cosmos. Therefore, all arguments based on causality are not sound unless they only apply to macro-scale observations within the universe, rather than arguments where quantum effects may be relevant, or arguments that encompass more than known space-time, that is, the universe. Before you bring up other types of cause other than the efficient cause, remember that the burden of proof is on you, and you need to demonstrate that such causes actually exist. Otherwise, the argument may be valid, but it cannot be sound. Soundness requires facts. Facts require empirical evidence, as you so kindly pointed out. Are we done? Because I can keep doing this. Oh, wait. You have more philosophers. Maybe one of them knew enough about physics and calculus to make a logically sound argument.
Heraclitus, on the other hand, took it to the opposite extreme and denied the notion of permanence altogether. The only metaphysical principle, he thought, was perpetual flux and change. Hence his famous maxim, you can't step into the same river twice.
So you've got a fellow who has some concept of how reality appears to work. For a modern example, I could point out that you aren't the same person you were when you started recording. Your body is in constant flux, exchanging molecules and atoms, cells dividing and dying. By now, not one single quark in your body remains from 2015. You've died and been reborn. Hallelujah! Or are you going to invoke Zeno's paradox and insist that a man who didn't know a damned thing about derivatives and integrals should be discussing division to infinity? This fucking shit's been solved since Newton.
Then comes Zeno, who was a disciple of Parmenides, and he basically agreed with his master on everything but applied his logic to local motion in particular. This is particularly effective against those who may wish to reduce qualitative change to local motion, but not so fast, Zeno would argue, for local motion is also rationally absurd. Imagine, he argued, a race between a tortoise and a hare. For the tortoise, or where the tortoise was given a head start, say. The tortoise is obviously significantly slower than the hare, so the race shouldn't really pose much of a challenge, right? But Zeno would argue the contrary. For in order for the hare to catch up to the tortoise, he would have to traverse half the distance between him and the tortoise. But in order for half that distance to be traversed, the hare would have to traverse half that distance. But in order to traverse half that distance, the hare would have to traverse halfway yet again. Since the distance is infinitely quantitative in this respect, it is impossible for the hare to move at all. Hence, even local motion is impossible. In reply to the obvious objection of, well, but I see it, they would just respond, well, who are you going to believe, your reason or your feeble senses? This is bound to strike any person of sound mind as absurd, but declaring it absurd does not really get at why it is absurd. It is no good simply to assert the evidence of our senses over and against the rational proof, for if the rational proof is sound yet untrue, then it would mean that reason itself is inherently defective, which demolishes logic altogether and even science. Furthermore, it would make your thoughts intrinsically absurd.
And this is yet another point where you are not even wrong. You're either confusing your terms or being intentionally obtuse. By definition, a sound argument is one in which the premises are true. The demonstration that the hare does in fact move is a demonstration that Zeno's paradox is not sound. And this can be so because rational thought is inherently not reliable. That's why we don't rely exclusively on it for anything important. Logic works on the Geigo principle. That is to say, if you feed garbage in, you will get garbage out. Logic is only as good as the factual basis for your premises. As to why you can trust your thoughts to not be absurd, in and of themselves you cannot. To argue that you can trust your thoughts not to be absurd on their own merit is to argue that your reason is infallible. I do not believe it is your intent to be so arrogant and obviously wrong as to claim you possess the perfection of pure reason. Only by testing your ideas against the observable world can you separate absurd thoughts from reasonable ones. After all, when you say something is absurd, absurd compared to what? Reality. What reality do we have? The reality that we observe. Therefore, at the end of the day, if there is a conflict between your metaphysics and observation, and you want your metaphysics to be in any way convincing, consistent, or useful, you must conform your metaphysics to observation. All of that out of the way, Archimedes demonstrated that a series of infinitely small numbers converges rather than diverges, thus proving Zeno's paradox to be false. The error is in thinking of Zenos as demonstrated by the observable world. So long as your senses are corroborated by the senses of others, you should trust them far more than mere internal reasoning. Worse, for any claim that we need Aristotle to save us from Zeno, the paradox is further refuted by the functionality of integral calculus. We have no need for any metaphysical or philosophical refutation of Zeno because observation, arithmetic, and calculus all demonstrate his paradox to be unsound. Full stop. Please don't tell me that your essences and existences are derived from Aristotle's refutation of Zeno and Parmenides, because there's no need for Aristotle's refutation. Their logic is unsound from start to finish. It only appeared to be sound because they did not have the benefit of over a millennia of investigation and inquiry, and they placed thinking above seeing. Oh, and make note of how declaring something to be absurd is not a refutation. You have to demonstrate it to be absurd using logic based on factually true premises. And the only basis for absurdity is comparison back to observation, not personal preference. So, again, you need that delicious, delicious empirical evidence.
So, how do we remedy this? Well, the philosopher Aristotle responded thoroughly to all of these arguments, and here is where they will bear significance to the video. In response to Heraclitus, he argued that pure flux or change is incoherent on the grounds that change necessarily implies the shift from one static state to another, which goes into the essence of change itself. And so the denial of permanence within change amounts to a contradiction.
There is no reason to believe that a temporary static state produces permanence. Remember my point about how every single quirk of your body has been replaced over the years? Even most static states we can describe are approximations of a constantly changing system in flux. There is no reason to conclude that permanence is a feature of the universe. So, Aristotle is just wrong on this point. There is no contradiction between constant change and temporary superficial stasis. Not his fault. He knew nothing about quantum mechanics and the fact that time and space may very well be derived quantities rather than fundamental. This is why we don't use 2,000-year-old metaphysics. Our observed world has answers for so much of their foundational presuppositions. Don't forget, it's not enough to assert that you can make modern physics fit into your framework. You have to prove it. And that requires proving the factual basis for your metaphysics, which requires you refer back to modern physics to develop your new presuppositions. This is why I don't care about Edward Fesser's defense against quantum mechanics. He's assuming his worldview, predicated on these arguments, is logically sound. Based on this worldview, he then argues that quantum mechanics has solutions consistent with this worldview. But the arguments cannot be logically sound when they are not based on factual premises. Not just premises that aren't false, but factually correct premises. QED, you're still wrong, because nothing you've said is either necessary or sound.
In response to Parmenides and Zeno, however, things get a little more interesting. In reply to Parmenides, the denial of change on the grounds that it violates the maxim that non-being can arise from being, or vice versa, he conceded that much, as any sound person really would. That is, that non-being cannot arise from being and vice versa. However, Aristotle denied that change necessarily amounts to that in the first place.
On the second point, good for him. On the first, you don't get to just assert that. It's a premise. Either it's proven to be true, or it necessarily makes all future arguments unsound. This is the very thing you said that we can't do. Reject claim or argument as absurd. Prove it, classical theist, or you are done. After all, virtual particles don't rely on vacuum energy. They appear to be entirely capable of being produced by literal nothingness, insofar as such a concept can even be conceptualized. That is to say, even if the vacuum energy were zero, virtual particles, in principle, can appear. Therefore, unless you present empirical evidence for some causal relationship back to virtual particles, we have no empirical basis to believe that something cannot come from nothing. Your argument is not only unsound, but tentatively falsified at this point. Should I just stop?
Instead, he argued that the outcome of change is not nothing. Let us return to our leaf example. Aristotle would say that the outcome of changing its color does exist, even if it has not yet happened, but it exists in potentiality, as inherent eminently in the leaf itself, inasmuch as it is an actuality. Thus, changing the color of the leaf is merely a reduction of the potentiality for the leaf to change color to the state of it actually changing color. The potentiality is still real, but characteristic of a different kind of being, that is, being in potency as opposed to being in act. Thus, potentiality and actuality must be both features of extra-mental reality, and this distinction has broader applicability than mere change, as I'm sure is obvious.
I suppose I just kept going. And it's not obvious, because neither you nor Aristotle have demonstrated a need for the existence of potentiality. You invented a solution to a non-issue and now have a new issue. How does potentiality exist if it cannot inhabit the actual thing? Since to inhabit the actual thing would be to cause the change described by the potentiality. What is your empirical evidence for the existence of these potentialities? Your foundation is made of wet clay, and there's a storm on the horizon.
First, let me just read the argument in syllogistic form, and then I'll unpack it. So premise 1. Essences, which is just to say, individual things that are intelligible as distinct objects, exist. Premise 2. If each essence is not the same as its existence, then those essences are contingent. Premise 3. If all essences are contingent and considered in themselves, they do not exist. Premise 4, just refer back to premise 1. And conclusion. Therefore, there is that whose essence and existence is indistinguishable, such that it is subsistent existence itself, and to this we give the name God.
I reject premise 1. These things only exist insofar as we develop language to describe similar objects and concepts. You have provided no sound argument upon which to base this premise. I reject premise 2, because you have not demonstrated premise 1, so I have no reason to accept essences as being extant things. I reject premise 3 because there appear to be multiple hidden premises within it which have not yet been demonstrated. I reject premise 4 because premise 1 has not been demonstrated. Therefore, your conclusion is not sound as you have failed to substantiate that your premises are true. Ergo, I reject your syllogism. Get back to us when you can prove premises 1 through 3 must be true with empirical evidence.
So, let's go through it. By essence, we simply mean what something is. There are many trees, for example, but they are all definitionally united as to their common nature. There are many triangles, but they are all united as to their shared nature of triangularity, not in a Platonic sense as though triangularity can exist separately from individual triangles, but inherent in particular triangles, or trees, or dogs, or what have you. This cannot coherently be denied without denying the obvious. It is clear that there's a shared principle whereby trees share common unity. All this really amounts to saying is that it is intelligible to talk about what something is.
Trees are not united by a common nature. They are united by a common definition, based on common characteristics determined by us humans. We set up a group of characteristics which we call a tree. There is nothing existent about the concept of treeness. This is mere pattern recognition. We see things that are similar enough to warrant a noun to group them together, so we invent one and catalog those characteristics that make the noun useful for conversation and communication of ideas. Nothing existential required. Same goes for triangles. Show me triangularity. You have reversed cause and effect, and by denying Platonism, you've denied the only hope you had of making this argument intelligible. The fact of the matter is that such groupings, such essences, have every appearance of being merely human labels for patterns, at least until such time as you can show me an essence. Show me triangularity, extant of itself. And I'll concede this point. If it exists and impacts the world, we can observe it. And before you repeat, this cannot be coherently denied, I refer you back to your own assertion that saying something is absurd, i.e., cannot be coherent, is not a refutation. You have to actually refute it. So your demonstration of premise 1 is false by your own standards.
This is implied by the reality of change. For example, when hydrogen and oxygen combine to make water, this can only happen if the potential to generate water is real as prior to the actual generation of water, given the principle of potency and act. Thus, since the nature of water must be real as potentiality, it follows that there is a whatness to particular instantiations of water, given the distinction between act and potency.
False. All that is required for the formation of water from oxygen and hydrogen is the chemical nature of oxygen and hydrogen in the correct environmental conditions. Asserting that there is some metaphysical whatness to water that allows for its creation is the addition of an unnecessary presupposition for which you have no evidence, and Occam's razor tells us to kill it. Your premise one isn't even on life support anymore if this is how you're going to justify it.
I realize this kind of requires a universal, or rather a realism about universals.
Which is yet another undefended assumption on your part that we can simply reject. Yes, you provided links in your description, but no one is obligated to purchase books or read a pile of dense jargon to help you make your very first point. I'll save people some trouble at least. Realism is the assumption that non-physical properties exist in reality. That is, on some level, beauty itself exists in and of itself, rather than as merely a construct of human language or as a way to talk about some conglomeration of more basic physical realities, which is kind of a necessary assumption for everything he said, so I don't know why he waited until halfway through his video to introduce the concept, then blazed past it with a too complicated sign. Really?
We can then proceed to arguing that essences are really distinct from their existence. So what is the grounds for making this distinction? Well, that's quite easy, actually. I mean, you exist, right? Well, have you always existed? Of course not. Moreover, you could go out of existence at really any instant. Should, say, a madman break into your house and kill you. Even here and now, though, the internal homeostasis of your biological makeup is a conditional for your very existence. And if that were to utterly fail, then you would just cease to exist. Furthermore, it is possible to conceive of what something is without necessarily conceding that it exists. We can, for example, conceive of the essence of a dinosaur without being committed to the proposition that dinosaurs still exist. While conceiving of a dinosaur as a single cellular organism, for example, would be to misconceive of a dinosaur, even if dinosaurs don't exist anymore, it would not be to misconceive of what a dinosaur is if we were to exclude its existence. While in actuality, the existence of the dinosaur and the essence of the dinosaur are not actually separable in reality, they are nevertheless really distinct from one another. Even on pure logical analysis, though, the real distinction between essence and existence, in at least all but one reality, must be conceded. For if we were to conceive of an essence in which essence and existence were not distinct, then there could only be one such reality.
This all boils down to we can talk about things without things existing. This does not make us talking about the thing an independent extant thing of itself. Conceiving is not being. Therefore, what a thing is not itself a real thing. And since this is your basis for the concept of essences, the whole argument collapses. Unless, of course, you had presented a sound argument for Aristotelian realism, which you failed to do, making premises 1 and 2 philosophical masturbation with no basis in reality. Without the first two premises, the whole argument falls down, and you've given us no factual basis for these premises, as I've already said. Just word games and false arguments that were stale 1,000 or more years ago. Your argument has failed at the first hurdle because, like all Thomists that I've ever read, you were too busy working your way from your desired conclusion to an argument, any argument that you could hold on to, rather than asking what reality could tell you about the world and metaphysics. I'm not kidding. I can't take another minute of this word salad mental masturbation. If your metaphysics is not informed by your observed reality, then it's only good for the gullible. Without a basis in fact, why should anyone believe you? And what better source of factual information have you ever found than the theories and results of science? Which one gave you your computer? Metaphysics? Physics? Which one has created Western civilization in a post-technical environment? Metaphysics? Physics? Which one has given you vaccinations? Metaphysics? Biology? Which one allows you to pick up content from anywhere in the world? Metaphysics? Science. You can't argue against the outcomes. If anyone really wants me to pick apart the rest of this rubbish some other time, let me know. Maybe I'll make it happen, but it's going to take more than a stout to work with. I'm InaneDragon, and if you've enjoyed this inanity, what's wrong with you? But consider subscribing for more. My subscription count is more bound, so it is probably senseless to invite you to subscribe. but I'll encourage it regardless. Also, share the video around, especially with people who think themselves classical theists, because they really need to cock the leaks in their arguments. For those masochists who enjoy the sound of my voice, I'd encourage becoming a Patreon. When I hit $50 a month, I'm going to start setting aside money for new audio equipment. Until next time, thank you all, and have a good night.